Marcus Thorne slid into the worn vinyl booth at Rosie's Diner, his weathered hands folding over the laminated menu. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across tables filled with truckers and late-shift workers. He had chosen this place specifically for its anonymity, a refuge where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. The waitress approached with tired eyes and a coffee pot that had seen better decades. Her name tag read Delilah, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked these floors for years. Marcus ordered the meatloaf special without looking up, his voice deliberately soft and unremarkable. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed acts of quiet courage in diners like this in your area. Delilah returned with his coffee, the ceramic mug chipped along the rim. Marcus wrapped his fingers around the warmth, savoring this moment of ordinary peace. 3 months since his last deployment, and he still found himself cataloging exit routes and potential threats out of habit. Tonight felt different, though, safer somehow. The diner settled into its evening rhythm around Marcus. A trucker at the counter argued with his dispatcher over the phone, while a young couple shared a piece of apple pie in the corner booth. The normalcy of it all should have been comforting, but something felt off. Delilah moved between tables with practiced ease, but Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the kitchen every few minutes. 20 years of reading people in hostile territories had honed his instincts, and right now those instincts were whispering warnings. The bell above the door chimed as 3 men entered, their expensive suits out of place among the blue-collar clientele. They surveyed the room with calculating eyes before choosing a table near the back. Marcus kept his head down, but his peripheral vision tracked their movements. The way they positioned themselves, blocking sight lines and covering exits, suggested this was not a social dinner. Delilah approached their table with visible reluctance, her notepad trembling slightly as she took their order. The largest man spoke in low tones that did not carry, but his body language radiated menace. When she walked away, Marcus saw her hands shaking as she clipped the order to the kitchen window. Marcus sipped his coffee slowly, each swallow deliberate as he maintained his cover. The 3 men had ordered steaks but barely touched their food, their attention focused entirely on Delilah's movements. One pulled out his phone and showed her something on the screen that drained the color from her face. She nodded frantically and hurried toward the kitchen, her composure cracking with each step. The cook, an elderly man named Pete according to his stained apron, glanced up with concern as she whispered urgently in his ear. His weathered face hardened with understanding, and he shook his head slowly. The largest suit stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The sound cut through the ambient chatter like a blade, causing several patrons to look up from their meals. He walked toward the counter with predatory confidence, his companions flanking him like wolves closing in on prey. Delilah backed against the coffee station, her eyes wide with terror as the man leaned close enough that his breath fogged the glass of the pie case. Marcus could not hear the words, but the threat was unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she reached for something beneath the register, her movements watched by 6 calculating eyes. The man's voice carried just enough for Marcus to catch fragments. Something about money owed, deadlines passed, and consequences that made Delilah's face go ashen. She fumbled beneath the register, pulling out an envelope with shaking hands. The man snatched it, counted its contents, then shook his head with theatrical disappointment. Not enough, he said loudly enough for half the diner to hear. The other patrons began shifting uncomfortably, some reaching for their wallets to pay and leave. The trucker at the counter kept his eyes fixed on his plate, unwilling to get involved in whatever drama was unfolding. Pete emerged from the kitchen wielding a spatula like a weapon, his jaw set with determination that his 70-year-old frame could not back up. The second man stepped forward, placing a hand inside his jacket in a gesture that needed no explanation. Pete froze, understanding flowing across his features like ice water. Delilah grabbed a napkin from the dispenser, her movements frantic as she scribbled something across its surface. The lead man was speaking again, his tone growing more menacing with each word. She folded the napkin quickly, her eyes scanning the remaining customers with desperate hope, searching for someone, anyone, who might help her in this moment of crisis. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from comfortable routine to suffocating tension. Most of the remaining customers avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their food or phones. The young couple in the corner booth threw money on their table and slipped out through the side door, leaving their pie half-eaten. Marcus maintained his relaxed posture, but every muscle fiber was coiled and ready. He had been in similar situations in Baghdad, Kandahar, and a dozen other places where civilians found themselves caught between predators and survival. The difference was that here, he was supposed to be invisible. Delilah clutched the folded napkin against her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. The lead man was growing impatient, tapping his fingers against the counter in a rhythm that suggested violence was his preferred solution to delayed gratification. His companions had positioned themselves strategically, one blocking the main entrance while the other covered the kitchen access. She looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the confrontation began, her eyes pleading across the distance between them. In that moment of desperate connection, she saw something in his steady gaze that gave her courage. She picked up the coffee pot with trembling hands and began walking toward his table, the napkin hidden beneath the handle. Delilah approached his table with forced casualness, the coffee pot steady in her practiced grip despite her inner turmoil. She refilled his cup without meeting his eyes, then placed the folded napkin beside his plate with the subtlety of someone accustomed to keeping secrets. Marcus unfolded the paper beneath the table, his expression unchanged as he read the desperate words scrawled in blue ink. "They killed my brother Tommy last week. Same debt. Police won't help. They'll kill Pete and me tonight unless someone stops them. Please." The simple plea hit him like a physical blow. He had spent years protecting strangers in foreign lands, but somehow this felt more personal. This was American soil, an innocent woman facing execution by criminals who operated with casual impunity. He looked up at Delilah, who was retreating toward the counter where death waited in expensive suits. Her shoulders were set with the resignation of someone who had exhausted all hope except for one desperate gamble on a stranger's conscience. The lead man was checking his watch now, his patience clearly at an end. He said something to his companions that made them both smile with anticipation. Pete had disappeared back into the kitchen, probably calling police who had arrived too late to matter. Marcus folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and controlled. 3 months of forced retirement had not dulled the razor-sharp instincts that had kept him alive through 14 deployments. He assessed the tactical situation with clinical precision. 3 targets, all armed based on their positioning and the bulges beneath their jackets. The leader carried himself like someone accustomed to violence, but not necessarily skilled at it. Street muscle, not military trained. The advantage of surprise belonged to whoever moved first, and right now, they believed they controlled the situation completely. The lead man snapped his fingers at Delilah, summoning her like a dog. She approached with leaden steps, each footfall bringing her closer to whatever fate they had planned. Marcus watched her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser, calculating angles and distances with automatic precision. 22 years of training whispered tactical solutions in his mind. Multiple entry points, innocent bystanders, confined space with limited maneuverability. Not ideal conditions, but he had worked with worse in Fallujah. The question was no longer whether he could neutralize the threat, but whether he was willing to break his carefully constructed cover to save 2 lives. The lead man grabbed Delilah's wrist with enough force to make her wince, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the promise of violence. Marcus saw her close her eyes, accepting whatever came next with the quiet dignity of someone who had already mourned her own death. That resignation broke something inside him that 3 months of civilian life had not quite healed. He thought of Tommy, a brother he had never met who died for the crime of owing money to predators. He thought of his own brothers in arms who had fallen protecting innocents half a world away, and wondered what they would say about letting evil flourish in their own backyard. Marcus stood slowly, leaving a $20 bill beside his untouched meatloaf. The movement was casual enough not to draw immediate attention, but purposeful enough to position himself for what came next. His reflection in the diner windows showed a man who had made his choice. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened, shoulders squaring with military bearing that no amount of civilian clothing could disguise. 22 years of lethal training flowed back into muscle memory as naturally as breathing. The off-duty Navy SEAL was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Marcus walked toward the counter with deceptive casualness, his footsteps silent on the worn linoleum. The man holding Delilah noticed his approach and looked up with mild irritation, expecting another customer trying to pay his check and leave quickly. "Excuse me," Marcus said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. The polite words hung in the air like a challenge, though the three men did not yet understand what they were facing. The lead man loosened his grip on Delilah's wrist, but did not release her entirely. "We're having a private conversation here," the man replied with casual menace. "Maybe you should mind your own business and walk away while you still can." Marcus stopped 3 feet away, close enough to strike, but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. His hands hung loose at his sides, but Delilah noticed something in his stance that reminded her of coiled springs. The way he balanced on the balls of his feet, the slight angle of his shoulders, the absolute stillness that preceded explosive action. "Actually," Marcus said with that same emotionless tone, "I think this is exactly my business now." The words carried a quiet authority that made the second man straighten unconsciously, some primal instinct recognizing a predator far more dangerous than anything they had encountered. The lead man released Delilah and turned to face Marcus fully, his hand moving toward the weapon beneath his jacket. It was a mistake that revealed everything about his lack of real training. Marcus had already calculated the draw time, the angle of approach, and 3 different ways to neutralize the threat before the man's fingers touched metal. The movement happened faster than conscious thought. Marcus stepped inside the man's reach, his left hand capturing the wrist before the gun cleared leather while his right delivered a precise strike to the solar plexus that dropped the leader like a stone. The weapon clattered across the floor, spinning under a nearby table. The second man lunged forward with Street Fighter instincts, throwing a wild haymaker that Marcus deflected with minimal effort. A quick pivot and elbow strike to the temple sent him crashing into the pie case, glass exploding in a shower of glittering fragments. The third man, wiser than his companions, was already backing toward the exit when Marcus turned his attention in that direction. The look in those steady gray eyes stopped him cold. This was not anger or aggression, but something far more terrifying. The calm professionalism of someone who ended lives as efficiently as other people filed paperwork. "You have approximately 30 seconds before the police arrive," Marcus said to the remaining man, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I suggest you collect your friends and leave. Permanently." The third man needed no further encouragement. He grabbed his semi-conscious companions, dragging them toward the exit with desperate efficiency. The leader groaned as he was hauled past Marcus, blood trickling from his nose, but wisely kept his mouth shut. Pete emerged from the kitchen holding a baseball bat, his eyes wide with amazement as he surveyed the destruction. 3 dangerous men reduced to bleeding, retreating shadows in less than 60 seconds. Glass crunched under his boots as he approached the counter where Delilah stood frozen in shock. Delilah stared at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time, which in many ways she was. The quiet man who had ordered meatloaf and coffee was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence commanded respect and inspired confidence. Her hands had stopped shaking for the first time in weeks. Marcus calmly retrieved the dropped weapon, ejecting the magazine with practiced efficiency before placing both pieces on the counter. 22 years of training had taken less than 2 minutes to save 2 lives, and in a reign of terror that local police had been powerless to stop. Sirens wailed in the distance as Marcus straightened his jacket and returned to his booth, picking up his coffee cup as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Delilah approached slowly, her eyes still wide with wonder and gratitude that transcended words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "They killed my brother Tommy for owing them money. Tonight, they were going to kill Pete and me to send a message to other debtors." Marcus nodded quietly, understanding the weight of what had been prevented. In war zones, he had learned that evil thrived when good people remained silent. Tonight, silence would have meant death for innocence, and that was something his conscience could never accept. Pete swept glass with reverent efficiency, glancing repeatedly at the man who had saved their lives with such devastating competence. Word would spread through the neighborhood about what happened at Rosie's Diner, about the quiet customer who turned out to be someone much more dangerous than anyone imagined. Police cars pulled into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the interior walls in alternating colors. Marcus Thorne, Navy SEAL, had returned to the shadows of civilian life, but tonight had proven that some warriors never truly retire. If this story moved you, drop a comment about your favorite moment or if you've witnessed similar quiet courage in your community.